I raised yesterday two possibilities that I did not agree with about the origin of the Jews of Eastern Europe. One of those possibilities was that the Jews of Eastern Europe were descended from the Khazars, and since I am an extremist and radical, I don't think the Khazars converted, and converts or not, they did not move to Eastern Europe. If they had moved to Eastern Europe, there would have to be footprints, signs. What kind of signs could we expect the Khazars to leave? Well, not in the ground, but the best footprints one can look for are in the language. What language did the Jews speak in Eastern Europe? Yiddish. If the Khazars had come and their descendants spoke Yiddish, what would I have to look for in Yiddish? Words in Turkish. Because the Khazars spoke a Turkish language, probably. If not Turkish, maybe something similar Central Asian. Now there are a few words in Yiddish that come from Turkish. For example, balagan. That comes from Turkish. However, before it came to Yiddish, it probably existed in Polish. There was much of Ukraine was ruled by the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century, and one did not need the Khazars to create a balagan. The Turks did a very good job by themselves. But one cannot find very many Turkish words in Yiddish. There are a few more, and every one of them is also found earlier in Polish. So there are no, what one can call, footprints. There are other footprints in Yiddish. There are words that come from French and from Italian. And this makes sense if we think that there was migration from the West. Because before Jews came to Bohemia, Moravia, to Austria, even before that, the Jews had lived in Italy, moved to the north, to Germany, and then moved east. So that makes sense. If the Jews had come from Khazaria, it's less likely they would have learned French or Italian on the way, although strange things do happen. But that's not one of them. So I dismissed, like this, the idea that the Jews were descended from the Khazars, and I also dismissed the idea that the Jews were descended from refugees from persecution. In central Germany, from the area of the Rhine, my feeling is that it is far away to the Polish lands, and usually refugees, what do they plan to do? They lived for many years in a certain place. There is a danger. They run away, and what do they hope to do? To go back. That's the plan. Sometimes it's possible. Very often it's not possible. But the plan is to go back to where they lived, where they had homes, where they had property, where they were familiar with conditions. As we shall see maybe later today or maybe tomorrow, that happened here in Ukraine. That after the events of 1648, or during the events, I have a theory, which you will hear, and maybe you will agree, and maybe not, but I do not think that very many Jews died during the uprising of Sosed Khmelnytshina. I think that the numbers that one sometimes reads about are false. Most of the Jews, I think, ran away, which was the intelligent thing to do, and when the fighting was over, they went back home, which was also the intelligent thing to do. So that one can look at cases of refugees, and usually they do not go very far. As we shall see, there is additional evidence. So we will get there. My theory is that most of the Jews who came to Eastern Europe came from regions which were close by. They came from Bohemia, Moravia, Austria. They went to places they were familiar with. They had information. Do you see it written here? It's not written, but you remember. They had information, and they came in small numbers. So I think that the numbers were quite small. Not every year, maybe 50 or 60 people. That's not very much. Somebody came, and then his cousin came, and then he wanted to get married, so his girlfriend came, and maybe her brother came afterwards. It was that kind of migration, very much like migration to London. You do not have a plane which is full of people who are going to live in London. Most people on the airplane are planning to visit and to come back, and most come back. There is somebody in seat 24 who will try to stay. And there's maybe a woman 2 rows behind who has a boyfriend in London. But these are limited numbers. How can we check this and look for evidence? We already saw that the earliest communities that we have information about are to the west, in Silesia or Krakow, which was the first stop for migrants to the east. What more evidence can we look for? Well, I think that the most important evidence that we can consider is language. And the language that the Jews spoke in Eastern Europe was Yiddish. However, not all Yiddish is the same. There are 2 major dialects of Yiddish. There is the Western Yiddish and, guess, Eastern Yiddish. The border of the 2 dialects goes somewhere from Prague to the south. Now, the differences are not major. People who speak one dialect can understand more or less the other, but they are significant. If anyone here is studying dialects in Ukrainian, you're familiar with the phenomenon. Same thing among the Jews. Now, this is an interesting question. What is the nature of the dialect that was spoken in Eastern Europe? Many very intelligent linguists have studied this question, and they have not found a good answer. It is a little bit like the Yiddish of Bavaria, around München. It is a little bit like the Yiddish in Bohemia. It has some signs of further north Yiddish. It's basically a mixture. Now, if the refugees who had fled the Rhineland had gone to Poland, what would be the nature of Yiddish? It would be Western Yiddish. The refugees who go from the West would have brought the language with them, and there would be no reason to change. What we see in Yiddish, though, in the East, is this mixture a little bit like one place to the east, another place. And this fits very well a pattern of migration where many individuals come from different places. So that if you have immigrants, some from Bohemia, some from Austria, some from the Eastern Germany around Nuremberg, they're all Jewish, they come to the synagogue, they speak to each other, their children will speak a dialect which is a mixture, because individuals cannot maintain a dialect. To keep a dialect, you have to have a group of people, and what is important is for them to be separate. They have to live by themselves, because if they live with other people who speak the same language, it will be mixed together. So that if you have a child whose one parent is from Eastern Ukraine and another parent is from Western Ukraine, the Ukrainian that the child will speak will probably be not like the father and not like the mother, but mainly like their friends in school. Wherever they live, that will determine the dialect. We will come back to dialects a bit later. So if we look at the dialects of the Yiddish, it fits very well a pattern of individuals who come one by one, and their language is mixed together. Not only were they influenced by the people who they met in synagogue, they also were influenced by the other German speakers. Because in many cities, for example in Krakow, in Lviv, much of the population was Germans, and this also has an influence. But that is not enough. What I've said is true, I think, but you cannot build a theory just on Yiddish. But one can look at other factors as well. Let us think about names, because names are interesting. The names of men are not interesting. Why? Because the names of Jewish men come mainly from which book? The Bible. And if not the Bible, the Talmud. Today we are very interested with equality. But the Bible was not. Almost all the names in the Bible are names of men. Now, there are 12 or 13 tribes of the Jews. There are really 13 tribes, but the lists are always compacted. But Jacob had 12 sons, according to the story in the Bible, and there are 2 tribes that were the sons of Joseph. That's why there are really 13 tribes. But what can you do? This happens. What is very strange is that Jacob had 12 sons, and according to the Bible, no daughters. I don't believe it. There were daughters. Cannot be there were no daughters. But what? The Bible was not interested in the girls. It was interested in the boys. What can I say? But when Jews had to pick names for boys, they always had David, Solomon, Shaul, lots of names from the Bible. But what is interesting is women. Women's names are very variegated. There are different kinds of women's names. And very often Jews, just as they preserved French and Italian words in their Yiddish, they preserved women's names generation after generation. However, what is interesting is that there were certain Jewish names for women that were very popular among the Jews in Germany. I have to look and see. If you think I remember this by heart, I don't know it by heart. Names like Edelheit, Jutta, Gottschalk, Guttheil. These names were very popular, apparently, in Germany. Nobody gave these names to their daughters in Poland. Now, if the Jews who came to Poland were refugees to Germany, what would they do? They would have given these names to their daughters. This was my mother's name, this was my grandmother's name. I will also give my daughter this name. We do not find these names. But we do find names which are Western Slavic. Names like Sprinza, all types of names that come from the environment. This fits again very well with migration that was nearby and migration that was very open to Slavic influences. And this makes very good sense. Another factor which is interesting is the way people pray. Now, for somebody who does not go to synagogue or to church very often, it does not seem to be very important how somebody prays. Here, turn off the camera. Between us, does God really care exactly how we say our prayers? I'm not sure, but I don't think so. However, for people who go very often to synagogue or to church, then this can become very, very important. It's very important how one makes the sign of the cross. It's very important how one says the prayers for Yom Kippur. It has to be one order and not another order. Now, some people thought this was very important. If we look at the prayers that were said by Jews in Eastern Europe, you already know what I'm going to say. They were not like the prayers that were said in Germany. They were typical to the way prayers were said in the west-eastern part of the Germanic lands, in Bohemia, Moravia. It is just like in Bohemia, Moravia, so it was in Poland and Ukraine. Now, if one goes to Israel today, I think it is nice to go to Israel. I think it is nicest to go to the beach. But if it's raining, you can go to synagogue instead. And if you go to synagogue, you will see that many people in synagogue pray just the way they did when they were in Africa or when they were in Ukraine and Poland. Prayer is very conservative. People don't change quickly. If many Jews had come from Germany to the east as refugees, they would have kept their old prayers. but we don't see any sign of these prayers. The prayers are just like they were in the region. Therefore, I think that one can say that there isn't very much drama, but it seems that most of the Jews in Eastern Europe were looking for a job. They were looking for a way to make a living. They came because they had information about opportunities, and they came in small numbers. After they arrived in the Slavic-speaking lands, then the population grew rapidly because conditions were good, and the same is true for the Slavic populations. The population of Ukrainians today is, of course, many times more than it was 300 years ago. And the same applies to other populations as well. And so the same took place among the Jews. And the question then becomes, how did the Jewish population spread in Eastern Europe? Now here, it is useful to consider the maps that I suggested that you bring with you, or you look at, but it's not necessary to look at them. I will tell you what it says on the maps. If we consider where there were large Jewish communities, as I've mentioned before, the largest Jewish communities were first in Poznan, then Krakow, and then further to the east, Lviv became very quickly a major Jewish community. Now, what can we learn from the location of large communities? First off, we should, afterwards Brzezh became a major community, after Lviv. We should consider which places did not have not major communities, but not even minor communities. Where could we have imagined that there would be a large community? One place is Riga. Why Riga? That was a major port city. It was a center of commerce. That is where most of the grain exports, the grain was shipped up to Riga and then from Riga to the west. And in the 15th and 16th centuries, this was a very important export market. But Riga did not have a large Jewish community. Where else could there have been a large community? Gdansk. Same thing. It was a major port, Danzig, but this was also an important port for the export of wheat, and the ships that took the wheat away came back with imports. But we do not find large communities there. Why? The reason here, I think, is relatively simple. The transport in the Baltic Sea was controlled by the Hanseatic League. This was an organization of traders who developed cities, and they had a monopoly on the trade, and they did not allow Jews to live in the port cities. Why? They did not want competition. This is understandable. If the Jews had organized these cities, they probably would not have allowed Germans. But the Germans organized and not the Jews. And every group that has a successful business does not want to have competition. If somebody organizes a good search engine for the internet, what will Google do? Destroy them. That's competition. It's a reality. So that the port cities in the north were closed because of ethnic policies of the Hanseatic League, which maintained a monopoly on the import and export from west to east. What option would there have been for Jews? If Jews want to be involved in trade, and Jews were generally not farmers, what options would there have been? Not trade by the sea, but trade over the land. Overland trade. This would seem to be the only option. And if we look at the map, we can see that the lines of trade from west to east, with some exceptions, and one has to deal with the fact that there are exceptions, but they went from the trade routes from Krakow to the east, went more or less from Krakow to Lviv. In Lviv, who were the major traders? Not the Germans, but Armenians. It was Armenians and Germans, but mainly Armenians, who controlled the overland trade further to the east. And the same way that the overland travel went east to west, that is where Jews found themselves places to settle. And they settled in those locations which were most promising, which is where the trade routes intersected. Now, if we look at the map, we see that the city of Brześć-Litewski is Brisk is located on a key route. That is the route from the west, either from Wrocław or Krakow, going which way? To the north, to Lithuania. So Jews were not able to trade with Lithuania coming from the sea, because the Hanseatic League did not welcome competition. They were able to come overland and head to the north. Now, this is a factor which leads us to an additional answer to a question we have not yet asked. But now I will ask, what is the nature of the Yiddish, what was the nature of Yiddish in Eastern Europe? There were basically three sub-dialects of Yiddish. There was a Yiddish that was spoken in the north, in what is basically today Lithuania and Belarus. That was one dialect. There was a dialect which was spoken in central Poland, which we can call what was later the Kingdom of Poland, Warsaw, Łódź, that area. And there was a third dialect of Yiddish, which was spoken in, depending on the time, you could call it Galicia or Ukraine plus southern Poland, depending on where the borders were. These were the three dialects of Yiddish. what can dialects do for people who are interested in history? What is necessary to maintain a dialect? As I said before, and everything I said, of course you remember, that dialects are preserved in isolation. If people are separate from other groups for a long time, they develop a dialect and they maintain it. The more that there is transport and communication, the more difficult it is to preserve a dialect. And this is often a topic for discussions and for people who are trying to preserve languages. But if we see that there were 3 dialects of Yiddish, we have to assume that this means that there were living in relative isolation for a long period of time. Now you are very polite, but you might ask, what is a long period of time? An hour and a half, 2 years? I mean maybe 200 years. That's the beginning of the time that you need to create a new dialect. So if we see there are 3 dialects, that means that these populations were relatively isolated. Now, how does this coexist with the question of the origin of the Jews? One possibility would be that the Jews of Lithuania came from the north, the Jews of central Poland came from the west, and the Jews of Ukraine came from the sky. That doesn't make sense. It seems the Jews could not come from the sky, they could also not come from the north. It seems that they came more or less with the same slow spread of population. And then we have to ask, what happened? The simple explanation is that even though they came in one common flow, it split. Some went north, some stayed, and some went to the south, to Ukraine. And then, after going, they stayed there. Instead of having continuous migration, there began to be a degree of stability. And the question then has to be, how could such a process take place? And the answer is that such a process could and did take place, I think. The Jews who first came to the east were not major bankers. They were not major traders dealing in import and export. That was done mainly by other foreign groups living in Eastern Europe. There were many Germans, there were many Italians, there were many Scots. Various groups came and lived in Eastern Europe. So the Jews more or less picked up what was left over. They did not have the capital, and they did not have the contacts to deal with major exports, and seeing that much of the export was grain to the north, to the cities of the Hansa, that was in the hands of the nobility in general. So Jews dealt with sometimes small money lending, they dealt in small trading, not wholesale, not large scale, but small, small businesses, sometimes crafts. However, this dynamic began to change in the 17th century. Because in that period, the export market for grain declined. Improvements in the agriculture in Germany, in France, and Holland meant that there was less import of grain, and thus the most important economic market declined. What did the Germans do when this happened? Many of them went back to Germany, and the rest assimilated wherever they were. The Italians, the same thing. The Scots, the same thing. The Jews stayed. Why didn't they go back? Why did they come to Poland in the beginning, or to Lithuania, or to Ukraine? Why did they come? Because of overpopulation in Austria, Bohemia, Moravia. There were too many children. And this was the engine for many historical developments, demographic growth. Because Jews had mainly found a way of making an income by providing services to the non-Jewish population. Economic services, trade services, craft services. And for this, as you recall when I mentioned the tailor, they needed to have a certain number of clients. Now, if a tailor's son becomes a tailor, I mentioned the fact that they cannot work together. They will not have enough clients. It is necessary to find a place where there are people who need a tailor. Now, when this happens, there's small-scale migration. When does this happen? If the Jewish population grows faster than the non-Jewish population, then we have a condition which forces migration. And this apparently was a constant situation in the Jewish world. Now here I will take a few minutes to discuss the factor of population growth. If we consider the population growth, it is very common to see statistics which talk about the fact that the average life expectancy was at sometimes about 40 years. Does this mean that when somebody was 40 years old, he would walk on the street and then die on the spot? No. What it means is that there were two children who were born. One baby unfortunately died when it was 2 years old. The other child grew up and lived till the age of 70. And what is the average lifespan of the two children? 36. That's the average. One lived 70, one lived 2 years old. Together 72, half is 36. The average is not so important. What was the date? The critical years were which years? From birth until the age of 5 or 6. If a child could live to the age of 5 or 6, or certainly to the age of 10 or 11, the chances they would live till the age of 60 were good. The problem was to survive the first 10 years, the first 5 years. Why? Because many, many young children died. Now, if we take a look at societies, we see that every society loves children, takes care of children. Almost every society does. There are variations and there are exceptions, but this is generally the case. The question is, what is the rate of marriage? What is the rate of fertility, the number of children born, and what is the mortality rate? Here, not surprising, you already know me after 3 hours, it is connected with economics. Okay, what happens? First off, one can bring in a little theology. By Jewish tradition, it is good to be married. In some Christian groups, a priest cannot be married. A priest has to be celibate, or if not a priest, at least a higher individual in the church has to be not married. In the Jewish tradition, it is the reverse. If a man is not married, he cannot be a rabbi. No one would go to a rabbi who's not married. It's not serious. So that the Jewish tradition encouraged marriage and encouraged marriage at what we would think today is early. Age 19, 20, 21. What determined the age of marriage among Jews? Very often it was the question of economic independence. Now, there were stories about Jews who got married very early. What is very early? 13, 14 years old. Why is it very early? Maybe I am being too much of a judge. I am not. I am correct. Because at that time, that was before males and females were even sexually mature. The age of physical maturity today is much lower than it was 200 years ago. It may be something in the food, it may be all the chemicals that we eat, but it is earlier today than it once was. And these people were getting married before they were physically prepared for marriage. But why did they do this? It was something of a status symbol. Let's say you drive in Kiev today. Which car will get me from here to the center of town faster? A Mercedes or a, I don't know, Zhiguli, whatever it is. It's all the same. When you get stuck in a traffic jam, in a probka, forget it. You're all together. So why do people buy a Mercedes? Because they want everybody to know, oh, I'm important. Some people, like me, I know I am important without a Mercedes, so I can do very well with an old Japanese car, an old Korean car, even worse. But some people are not certain and they need a Mercedes. 300 years ago, people showed they were important. Why? How? The children would get married very early, and what happens after the children get married early? It isn't that a 13-year-old boy goes and becomes a big businessman. He still is a little boy. And the father of the bride has to support them, has to give them a place to live, has to feed them. It's only years later that they can become independent. But everybody knows, oh, look, this person is so rich, he can support a whole new generation for years. So, before there was Mercedes, there were young couples. Most other people who were not rich had to wait. A tailor had to wait until he learned how to be a tailor. A shoemaker had to wait until he learned how to be a shoemaker. Every profession had the time that it was necessary to study. After a person learned to be economically independent, then they could get married. Now, the people who got married at the age of 19, were they rich or were they poor? What? They were poor. They were learning a trade. A tailor, by definition, is not rich. A shoemaker is not rich. The people who were rich got married when they were younger in traditional Jewish society. But when people got married at the age of 19, who did they marry? They married the partner they wanted to marry. When somebody is 19 and they are independent, you cannot tell them, marry this person, marry that person. They will say, I am independent. Don't tell me what to do. I know who I want to marry, both males and females. So we see an interesting dynamic. Being rich is very nice. Believe me, it's nice. My brother is rich, and he is very happy. However, if you are rich and get married, who do you have to marry when you're 12 or 13 or 14 years old? You have to marry somebody the parents pick. If you are poor, you can choose yourself. What is better? I don't know. But everything in life has a balance. But what is important is that by the age of 20, 21, most Jews were married, and when they got married, they had children. Now, according to the statistics that we have, and there are not very many statistics, who had more babies, Jews or non-Jews? Don't tell me, I will tell you. Jews had generally fewer babies. Why? Because in the Jewish tradition, mothers breastfed their children for a long time. What is a long time? 2 years, 3 years. Children could walk, they could talk, and they continued to breastfeed. Now, this had two important results. What does breastfeeding do to fertility? It makes it lower. Breastfeeding creates hormones in the mother that make her less fertile. This is the biology which says that the body is not ready for another baby. Now, everybody knows that birth control is more effective than breastfeeding. Breastfeeding is not 100%, but it brings fertility down. What does it do to child mortality? Also lower. The more a child breastfeeds, the healthier the child is. I mean, after 3 years, enough is enough. But Jewish mothers tended to breastfeed for a long time. If we consider compare the Jewish the patterns of breastfeeding to non-Jewish patterns, we find two independent differences. First off, in many agricultural societies, a young man said, what will I be in the future? I will be a farmer. But very often it was necessary to wait until land was available to become independent, and for many this was a reason to postpone marriage. And postponing marriage brings fertility down. For many young men, what was necessary in order to get land? For the father to get sick or to die. This was created a very strange situation. You are familiar, perhaps, with the Queen of England. I'm not saying she is your friend, but you know about Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth has a son, Charles. What does Charles say every morning? Charles wakes up in the morning and he says, "Did my mother die?" Why does he ask? Because the day she dies, he will become the king. I promise you, at the funeral, Prince Charles will look very sad. Maybe he will cry, but inside he will say, "Finally." Because that lady lives and lives and lives, and as long as Elizabeth is alive, he cannot be a king. The same way in a society of farmers, children loved their parents, but at the same time, they knew that when a father can no longer be the master of the land, that is the opportunity for children. If the father is a tailor, or the father is a shoemaker, the son does not have to wait for his father to die to take the store or to take the place of work. What can he do? If he is a shoemaker, he can take his skill where? To another place. He can find a place where they need a shoemaker, and he can begin right now to open his shop. He does not have to wait for the father to leave him his shop. Land is very different. Land offers security, it is a promise of food, but it is limited in supply. So Jews generally could marry earlier, and then we come to the second difference. In a farming society, much of the work is done by men, but women have to help a great deal. There are certain times of the year where the help of women is essential. If a Jewish woman is working in a city selling food in the market or having some kind of washing clothes in her home, whenever the baby cries, she can stop and feed the baby. What about a woman who was married to a farmer? If she is working in the field, she will not hear the baby cry. Who hears the baby cry? Her mother or her husband's mother. And what do you do when the baby is crying? You have to feed the baby. And if the mother is not there, how do you feed the baby? You have to give the baby today a bottle, or before there were bottles, you would take a bowl of milk or a bowl of kasha, of cereal. You would put a rag in the food, and the baby would then suck the food out of the rag. What did the baby get from the rag? It got food, and it also got all of the bacteria and all the diseases that were in the neighborhood. what is a better way to feed babies? Breastfeeding. But if there is no choice, there is no choice. There was no other alternative. But the result was that more babies died when they were not breastfeeding. So as a result, Jewish women tended to breastfeed longer. They had fewer children, but of the children that were born, most of them could survive. Whereas other populations, mainly the farmers who were the majority, they had more babies because breastfeeding did not lower fertility. They did not breastfeed so long, but many of the babies died. So this created a constant imbalance. The Jewish population was always growing. Now, in the period where there was migration from west to east, the solution for the overpopulation of Jews was to migrate. Jews looked for new opportunities in the Slavic-speaking lands. And they found them, and slowly the population spread more and more to the east, and we can see how the population went according to the trade routes. But then, what happened? How were the Yiddish dialects created? Here, there was an interesting phenomenon. The market for grain declined in the West. There was less export of grain from east to west because of better technology in the West. Now, this created a big problem for the traders, and many of them left. But it created an even bigger problem for who? For the nobility, for the rich landowners. Now, the truth is, we do not have to cry for their troubles. They were rich, they were oppressive, they did not get their land because they were nice, and they were very harsh on the farmers and on the peasants. But they had a problem. They had once made a great deal of money by exporting grain. This option became more limited, and now they needed new sources of income. And it was at this time that they decided that they could get more money by developing systems of taxation of the peasants, and that they would raise money by collecting taxes. How can you collect taxes? First off, you can take things away from the peasants, but enough is enough. You cannot oppress without limit. One other option would be to seek alternative methods of making money, and one of the best was setting up inns and the development of the alcohol industry, and encouraging peasants and farmers to drink alcohol, and the profits would go to the landowner. How was the alcohol made? It was made from grain that a generation before would have gone to export. Now that it could not be exported, it was used locally. Here is where Jews were given opportunities to work for landowners in administering the newer systems of taxes. Jews had little options, and this was for them an opportunity. Now here we have to consider the question of location. If Jews are going to operate taverns or inns or places where drinks are sold in villages, where do they have to live? In villages. So that whereas in the first migration to the east, Jews were to largely in big cities, not all, and not even 60%, but most lived in cities. Now there was a development of movement from cities to smaller locations because here there were economic opportunities. What did this do to population growth? It rose. Because, as you recall from yesterday, and you of course remember everything, small villages are healthier than cities. So that population growth had been a problem, now it became an even bigger problem. In 300 years, there would be a solution. Industry, factories. In factories, there was a need for many workers. But there was no major industry in 1600 and 1700. The only industry that existed was to work for landlords. So we have a rising spread of Jews from cities to nearby towns. To find a job collecting taxes or to run an inn, what was necessary? To find the job, a person needed information. And the information was always local. So we can understand why Jews, wherever they were in, say, 1600, began to spread. But where did they spread? Inside the region they lived. They did not hear about a small inn 600 kilometers away. Nobody knew there was an inn there. They heard about an inn 10 kilometers away or 20 kilometers away. So migration began to be short migration and not long distance migration. Does this fit with the development of dialects? It does. This is precisely the situation in which there was constant migration inside a region, but limited distance migration. People stayed more or less within the same region, and as the general population grew, there were more opportunities. When will this situation end or come to a conclusion? We can predict when there are so many Jews that there is not anywhere in the region a place to earn a living, either as a craft, as a shoemaker, as a tailor, or as a tax collector, when there is no other opportunity within the region, either mortality will begin to rise, people will die of hunger, and as you know, very few people die of hunger. Hungry people die of diseases. When somebody is hungry, they get sick more quickly. Even without literally starving to death, they are victims of their poor health conditions. So mortality can rise, or what is the better solution? Again, to try long-distance migration. So when we have this situation in the 16th and 17th centuries, there is not yet a need for long-distance migration. Options are available within the region, and a growing population begins to fill in more and more places within the region. how then did the Jews manage? Because if one wants to collect taxes from a farming population, what is necessary? The farmer has to pay money in coins. Where will the farmer get the coins to pay? The Jews who ran the inns also had to begin to deal in trade. They could not take the grain from the farmers, that went to the landlord, but they could buy honey, they could buy wool, all kinds of agricultural products, and therefore, as time went on, they created both the economic basis for peasants to pay taxes and also the basis of an economy of trade from small towns to centers and to provide for an internal market of agricultural goods, some of which could be exported overland to the west, and new markets for new products occasionally could be created, whether it be for cattle or horses or candles that were made from beeswax. Various items could be exported, and this was part of the process of developing within the local economy. So that we have a process of depopulation, and as transport improves and cities begin to grow, again, there is a process of strengthening of urban populations. Now, I think that I will stop at this point. I would like to get on to the questions of population movement in the 19th century, but I don't want to stop in the middle of it. I will try tomorrow to deal with the population developments in the 19th century, and then to deal with questions of urbanization. I did ask you to look at an article which I sent you by an author named Roland, dealing with geographical patterns of Jewish population. This is not an easy article. I do not think it's an article that you would read for the enjoyment of it. But it is an important article, and I do want to just to mention one term before I leave, that if you take a look at it, it might help you understand. And that is the term of, just a second, about the fifth page. Yeah, dissimilarity index. Now, this sounds like two big words, and it sounds complicated, and it actually is complicated. But it is an important idea. What he wants to say is, if you look at two populations, let us say Jews and Ukrainians, and look at the breakdown, whether they live in villages, towns, or cities. You can say that a lot more Jews live in cities than Ukrainians do out of the total population. But a lot more is not very scientific. And how can we say this in numbers? And basically what he means by dissimilarity index is how many Jews and how many Ukrainians or Russians or Poles would have to move for their population breakdown to be similar. And sometimes many would have to move to have similarity. Sometimes not very many people would have to move to have similarity. And what he finds is that in general, in many cases, the differences at first glance look major, but when you think about it, not very many people would have to move to have a similar breakdown of city, town, and village. So what he tries to do is to take some of the impressions that we have or feelings and try to present them in quantitative terms. And I'll try, if I can, tomorrow to discuss some of this. It's possible to spend weeks discussing this article. It's very rich. We will not do so. We will spend minutes and not weeks, but you might find it interesting and a little bit interesting, even though I said it's not, but it really is. And if you do not find it interesting, that just means that you're normal. So, I will stop here, and hopefully we can continue tomorrow.